Wild Fermentation, the Flavor, Nutrition, and Craft of Life Culture Foods Updated and Revised Edition by Sandor Katz, Chapter 11, Beers. Beers are alcoholic beverages made primarily from grains. In contrast with the honey, sugar, and fruit-based beverages we've covered so far, all simple carbohydrates that spontaneously ferment into alcohol, grains are complex carbohydrates that must be digested first into simple carbohydrates before yeast can ferment them into alcohol. This requires an additional step. Therefore, beer making is always a more complex process. In the Western tradition, this is accomplished by malting, which means germinating or sprouting the grain. The germination releases enzymes that break down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars, a process intended to nourish the emergent plant, but one that, as fate would have it, ends up nourishing yeast instead to produce alcohol. Directions for sprouting grains are found on page 246. I'll walk you through a couple of beers that are started from whole grains, transformative processes beginning simply with dried grains. Most home brewers do not actually malt their own grain, however. Commercially available malted grains are probably more efficient to use, widely available, much easier, and produce flavorful, distinctive brews. There are two other ways that people use to convert complex carbohydrates of grains into simple sugars to ferment into beers. One is through the action of malts. Across Asia, rice and other grains are fermented into alcoholic beverages like sake, using aspergillus and other malts, which contain enzymes that break down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars. Koji, used for amazake in Chapter 8, and for miso in Chapter 9, as well as sake, is a Japanese example. The other method people use for this important carbohydrate conversion is to chew grains and saturate them with saliva, which also contains enzymes that digest complex carbohydrates. Perhaps you have noticed that if you chew long enough on a morsel of starchy food, it starts to taste sweet. Digestion begins in the mouth, and your body wastes no time breaking down food into simpler nutrients. Chewing on grains and spitting them out is a low-tech and ancient means of carbohydrate conversion for beer making. This is exactly how we'll make our next ferment, chicha, which is followed by examples of beers produced using molds and malting. Ooh, chicha. That was in Andrew Weil's book. Chicha, an Andean chewed corn beer. I start with this because chewing is the simplest means of achieving carbohydrate conversion and thought to be the most ancient. The word chicha actually describes a broad range of South American beverages, mostly alcoholic but some not, mostly corn-based but some not, and with many other varied ingredients. Chicha was considered by the Incas the vehicle that linked man to his gods through the fecundity of the earth. What the heck does that mean? The chewed variation is not extremely widespread at this point, but the tradition is said to persist in some Andean communities. This chicha has a light, delicious, corny flavor. An integral part of this chicha-making process is chewing the corn to saturate it with enzyme-rich saliva. Later in the process, the brew is boiled for an hour, killing any germs in the saliva. The salivated corn gobs are called muco. Traditionally, muco has been produced communally by old people and children sitting in a circle and telling stories. Recruiting people to chew corn with me has been very interesting. To me, it seems adventurous and weirdly intimate to chew food, spit it out, and intermingle it. Some of my friends have been excited to try the simple process and join a circle of chewers, but the squeamish ones were utterly repulsed by the thought of it. We intrepid chewers derived much pleasure from the emphatic refusals of the saliva phobes. If you embark upon a chicha-making adventure, the sensational accounts of it are likely to persist long after you exhausted your supply of delicious corn beer. This recipe uses berries to start the fermentation, yielding a variation of chicha called frutillada with bright color as well as flavor. Black raspberries gave a batch of mine a salmon hue. Wow. Okay, there's a recipe. Takes 2 weeks, and you need whole kernel corn. Use nixtamalized corn as described on page 151, or whole kernels that have not been nixtamalized. And then you need some polenta or grits, and then you need organic berries. Rice beer. Sake is the most widely known example of a beverage fermented from rice, and also the most elaborate and refined in process. Sometimes sake is described as rice wine, but because the defining characteristic of beer is that it is made from grain, I think of it as rice beer. This rice beer, like chicha and most indigenous brews around the world, is opaque rather than clear, a starchy suspension like a thin gruel. Similar beverages, varying in starters, specific processes, and ingredients, are fermented all across Asia from rice and other grains. This simple and accessible method for making your own rice brew uses as a starter what are commonly called Chinese yeast balls, widely available in Asian markets and online. And it has the recipe. Sprouting grains. Sprouting grains, also known as malting, makes them much sweeter. The power of germination creates enzymes that break down the complex carbohydrates of the grain into simple sugars. Germination starts with soaking grains or other seeds in water, but if you leave them submerged too long, they will ferment and eventually rot rather than germinate. Germination requires oxygen as well as water, so seeds must be drained to have access to oxygen, then repeatedly rinsed and drained to keep moist. When used with unmalted grains, enzymes from the malt can break down more carbohydrates, especially at elevated temperatures. Recipes that involve sprouting refer to these directions, and each specifies the type and amount of grain to use. So I'm looking at the recipe or the instructions, and the thing that kind of pops out, one, that you have to rinse the sprouts at least twice a day, and number two, once the sprout reaches about 3/4 the length of the seed, the fermentable sugars and desired enzymes are at their peak. Use them soon. Store in a refrigerator for a few days. Booza, Egyptian beer. Wow, sounds a lot like booze. Booza is an ancestor of the beer we know and love, which lives on in various forms in contemporary Egypt, East Africa, Turkey, the Balkans, and beyond. Like most indigenous beers, booza is a cloudy, starchy suspension. Fizzy, tart, and mildly alcoholic, booza, made by roughly the process described here, is more than 5,000 years old. But the particulars of this recipe are my own interpretations based on information from several sources, most notably an article in the anthropology journal Food and Foodways. Booza requires only 2 ingredients: grain, wheat, barley, or potentially others, and water, manipulated in several different ways. The process for booza vividly illustrates the bread-beer connection. Wheat formed into loaves of bread as part of the process, and traditionally a way yeast was stored for booza making was in partially cooked loaves, where the center remained raw and alive. In essence, making bread was a convenient way to store raw materials for brewing beer, reports Archaeology magazine. Wow, so the recipe shows that you actually have to sprout your own grains and then make bread, and from that, you make the beer. Whoa. African sorghum beer. Sorghum beer is a traditional beer of much sub-Saharan Africa. An opaque suspension, like other indigenous beers, it is fresh and inviting with its sweet alcoholic sour flavor. Opaque beer is more a food than a beverage, states a report of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. It contains high proportions of starch and sugars, besides proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals. Tezguino. Tezguino is an indigenous beer of Mexico made from malted corn. It's delicious and easy to make. Takes 1 to 10 days. You need a crock and 3 cups of whole organic field corn, not fresh sweet corn. Some thoughts on home brewing. The basics of brewing beer are not so different from any of these last few recipes. Take coarsely ground malted barley, added to hot water, and it becomes the mash. Hold the mash at successively higher temperatures at which different enzymes optimize, yielding flavor complexity. Once the mash reaches about 170 degrees Fahrenheit or 77 degrees Celsius, strain out the spent grains and sparge or gently rinse them with hot water to capture residual sugars. Boil the sweet, fragrant strained liquid, now called wort, for an hour or more. Add hops and other flavorings at various stages of the boil. Cool, add yeast or use some other method of introducing yeast into the cooled wort, and ferment. This brewing process can certainly be done with improvisational tools, but it has given rise to great technical inventiveness. Brewing systems at every scale are wonders of engineering, plumbing, and ingenuity. Like many people, I have felt intimidated by the equipment and the jargon and the accompanying compulsiveness about sterilization. Quote, "There's a lot of talk about the necessity for the use of chemicals to keep everything sterile, the need for other chemicals to make the beer work well, the crucial necessity for Teutonic authoritarian temperature controls, and the importance of complex understandings of minuscule differences in grains, malts, hops, and yeasts." End quote, writes Stephen Herod Buhner in Sacred and Herbal Healing Beers. Quote, "Generally, this frightens off a lot of people and takes the fun out of brewing." End quote again. Long ago, I borrowed a motto from an old friend who homebrews, Tom Foolery. Oh gosh, I'm sure that was his name. Cleanliness, not sterility. Really, if you think about it, in your home, sterilization is a fantasy. Sure, there are all kinds of chemicals that can fleetingly sterilize, but then after you rinse whatever it is with non-sterile water and dry it in a non-sterile air, or with non-sterile towel, it's no longer sterile. It's important to be clean and to use clean vessels and utensils and to have a clean working area. But a good beer does not require sterility. And in some cases, actively cultivating environmental exposure to wild bacteria and yeasts can result in exciting flavors. Don't worry. As Charlie Papazian counsels in The New Complete Joy of Home Brewing, quote, "Relax, don't worry, have a home brew, because worrying is like paying interest on a debt you may never have owed." End quote. Profound advice. My earliest experiences of brewing beer skipped the complicated process of extracting sugars from grains, relying instead on malt syrup from a can, added to hot water, then cooked with hops and or other herbs, cooled, pitched with yeast, and fermented. This is certainly an accessible way of making beer, but didn't really satisfy my curiosity about the basic transformative processes. My first introduction to brewing beer from grain was not until I was writing the first edition of Wild Fermentation. In March 2002, my dear friend and fellow fermentation experimentalist Patrick Ironwood first walked me through the process. Patrick has been brewing since age 15, when his parents gave their budding do-it-yourselfer a home brew kit, and he made his first batch of beer for them. 20 years later, Patrick was brewing in 30-gallon or 120-liter batches and storing his beer in kegs. Beer making has much specialized equipment and paraphernalia. The people who get into brewing beer tend to be techies. Patrick and several other homebrewers I have met have gone so far as to weld modifications to their equipment. I've also had the opportunity to visit many small breweries, and I can only marvel at the complexity of it all. Absolutely, become part of the homebrew movement. Make excellent beer. Enjoy it and share it. I would especially encourage folks in this direction of experimenting with wild fermentation or mixed cultures rather than pure strain yeasts. And these are the kinds of funky sour beers I get most excited about. But if you wish to explore the complexity of brewing beer from malted barley, then you need to consult a more specialized book than this one. Thankfully, many excellent guides are available. And then there's a further reading section, but that is it.